Welcome everybody to the Behavior Job Alike meeting on Thursday, October 28th. For those of you who have not joined us before, this group is a group that is put on by the Human Animal Support Services group to get us all together and talk all things behavior. The registration has changed, so everybody who's here today has obviously made it here. Hopefully we don't have anybody stuck in our old meeting invite, but welcome. I wanted to start with any updates, successes, upcoming webcasts, any information, learning opportunities that anybody knows about. Does anybody have anything that you want to share? I can start. I saw yesterday, I believe, or the day before, that HSUS has a webcast on November 4th about at 12 p.m. Pacific time. It's a shelter behavior roundtable, behavior support for long stay shelter cats and dogs. It looks like it's going to be an interesting one. You can go to the ASPCA Pro website to learn more about it and sign up for that webcast. Any other announcements? Bobby, thanks for putting that link in. You are fast. All right. If we don't have any other announcements, we're going to jump right in. This meeting is normally an hour. It's going to be 90 minutes today because we have a special presentation that is going to take 90 minutes. Understand that some of you might not be able to stay, but we hope that many of you can stay for the whole thing. I'm really excited to introduce Mara Velez. I met Mara a couple years ago now at, I believe it was at an IABC conference probably. And Mara is the executive director of the Shelter Playgroup Alliance. She's also a certified professional dog trainer. She also has lots of initials after her name, in that she has a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychology. She also completed all of the coursework for a doctorate in education, which is super impressive. And her and I both live in the same neck of the woods, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Mara spent over a decade in sheltering, including several years as a behavior and training consultant at Contra Costa Animal Services. So welcome, Mara. We are so excited to hear you talk about the least intrusive, minimally aversive principle today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheila. And I will share my PowerPoint.
And sorry, Mara, before you do that, I forgot to mention, if you have questions during this presentation, please just type those questions into the chat. And Mara, are you going to try to get to questions through the presentation, or do you want to hold those for the end?
I will. I actually just opened the chat window, so I can respond to any. I'll periodically look over there and answer as we go along, so you don't have to wait to answer your question. So one of the things that Sheila didn't mention is that I'm on the board of directors for the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants, which is the IAABC, and our remit as an organization for IABC is to certify animal behavior professionals. And we have an ethics remit as well, which is based on LIMA. So we'll talk about what LIMA actually means and how least and minimally fit into behavior modification as well. So we're going to start with some definitions. So we'll break down the two components of LIMA. So least intrusive. So least, I think we all sort of colloquially know that it means not very much of anything. And then intrusive, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So what is intrusiveness means? So actually the best way to describe it, and the way that it's described in the ABA literature, is actually restrictiveness. So what is least restrictive? So limiting the number of restrictions on the animal. Okay, still that's a little confusing. So what does that actually mean in practice? So the least restrictive principle is expanding the number of ways that an animal can contact reinforcement. So how many choices does that animal have? So if you're familiar with statistics and you're familiar with the concept of degrees of freedom actually plays a really nice role here in terms of understanding this concept. So if an animal has one option for contacting reinforcement, then that means that they actually have no choice. So that does not mean least restrictive. So if you're saying do this or else, and the only way that you can get reinforcement is by doing this one particular thing, the animal has no choice. So better is to offer more than one option. You can do this or you can do this and you can get reinforcement. Even better, offering more options, more choices. 3 options means that animal, we have 2 degrees of freedom, animal has 2 choices. So we'll explore a little bit of how to do that. And I have some video about offering least restrictive. So if you're trying to think about like, well, what does my training plan then look like if I'm using the principle of least restrictiveness? What does that look like? So we'll get there, but hold that concept. So then we get to minimally aversive. Minimal, again, small amount, we're good, but aversive, what does that actually mean? So I want to distinguish between aversive stimuli and stimuli that punish. So aversive stimuli are events that an animal will work to escape or avoid. They may be nuisances, not nuances, nuisance. They may cause a little bit of frustration, but it won't necessarily punish behavior. So we want to stay away from anything that is positive punishment. So an aversive stimuli, just want to differentiate, a punisher is something that when applied will reduce the probability of that particular behavior occurring in the future. Aversive stimuli is just something that an event is something that the animal will work to escape or avoid. So punishers are always aversive, but aversive stimuli are not always punishers. Just want to make sure that we have that distinction in the room. What LIMA is not, so just want to put this like very 100% clear. It is not a rationale for the use of aversives. Period. End of story. Nope. We're not saying that any use of aversives is fine. So there's a second component of LIMA, and that is trainer competence. And this is a less discussed piece of the least intrusive, minimally aversive ethical standard that you see articulated both by 3 bodies who have adopted it: APDT, CPDT, KPA has signed on to the joint standards, and then IABC. So those are all of the certifying bodies or membership organizations who have adopted the least intrusive, minimally aversive standard as part of their ethics. So the second component, least discussed, is trainer competence. So having the knowledge, skills, attitudes, experience, ethics, abilities, and a growth trajectory toward becoming a good trainer or behavior consultant. So what does that look like for a trainer or behavior consultant? First, body language, having a very deep and fluent knowledge of the behavior of whatever species you're working with. So if you're working with birds, you know about bird body language. If you're working with cats, you know all about cat body language, the function of all of that, those social signals, identification of stress signals, all of that. So by fluent, I mean that you do it quickly and accurately. So that's the definition of fluency. So whenever we have a behavior that is fluent, either in our animal or in ourselves, the definition of fluent is that you read it well you have high degree of accuracy, and then also your speed of reading that. And that takes a while to develop a good read of, if we're talking about dogs, of canine body language, because there are lots of signals that dogs have that describe how they're thinking, feeling, and what their intentions are, if they're engaging in distance increasing behaviors, distance decreasing behaviors, and however they're expressing their emotion. So next area of competence is mechanical skills. Are you good at using positive reinforcement? Do you have an excellent timing? And do you know how to deliver reinforcement in a variety of ways? You know how to shape behavior. You know how to capture behavior. You know how to use targeting to get behavior. You can use lure reward effectively without a dog becoming lure dependent. So all of those mechanical skills. Can you fluently read an environment and identify some of the ways that you can change the environment in order to support that animal, to make the behavior easy for that animal to do? So those are parts of mechanical skills. Okay, and then next, techniques for training behaviors, just for acquisition, fun behaviors, whatever it is, not necessarily behavior modification, because that's a whole nother level of skill, right? So can you train behaviors? Can I say, go teach this dog a dead retrieve? Do you have a number of ways of doing that? Can I ask you to put a chain of 5 behaviors together and put all of those behavior on stimulus control? So those are techniques for training behaviors. So we want to develop those. How can you get a lot of that? Those are where, organizations like the Karen Pryor Academy for Animal Training, you go and pay a bunch of money and acquire those skills, and you're under supervision of an experienced trainer. Next are techniques for behavior modification. So behavior modification is how are you reducing the probability of a problem behavior occurring in the future without the use of punishment, by employing differential reinforcement strategies. So differential reinforcement of lower intensity behaviors, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. So all of those techniques of behavior modification, and understanding, again, really fluently, setting the context for those variables. And of course, when we're talking about often behavior modification, we are using antecedent arrangement, or the change of the environment, in order to support that animal of doing the right thing, in addition to inserting an appropriate alternative behavior, training that up to fluency, and then implementing that behavior in the context in which we previously saw the undesired behavior. So trainer competency being a key component of LIMA. So when we then start looking at what does a LIMA training plan look like? So those were all just really definitional terms, breaking them, the 2 components. If you go and look at the website, or look at the joint standards for, again, APDT, CCPDT, IABC, KPA, those joint standards articulate what the LIMA standard is. So you have all of that, but what does that mean in practical terms? So it means that we're avoiding techniques that can lead to fear, anxiety, stress, and frustration. So this is our FAS plus F, right? So this is from our fear-free nomenclature. So we're avoiding fear, anxiety, stress, frustration, and then we're keeping the animal under threshold. So I'll explore a little bit what threshold means. I'm sure that it's a familiar concept to you, but I'll talk about how I identify it. And I'll show you some videos of that as well, or a video of an animal going over a threshold and then recovering. So first thing we're not going to use, if we're really taking the least intrusive, minimally aversive ethical approach very seriously, is that we're not going to use extinction. What is extinction? So extinction is the removal of reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. Seems pretty simple. And I have the photo of a dog jumping. That is one of the things that we are often often told, or at least what I was told when I was learning behavior early on, just turn your back on the dog. Well, that's extinction, right? That's removal of reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. The behavior strengthened because it was reinforced, very likely. And then if we're trying to remove ourselves, we often don't do a very good job. So it's not actually a great procedure. But extinction can come in a number of different forms. I've certainly seen folks use extinction procedures in just like waiting an animal out. But the research, the literature on extinction is that that level of frustration can increase so much that you start to see forms of aggression. So there's been a ton of laboratory research on the use of extinction, and it's just something best to avoid because definitionally it causes frustration. So we certainly don't, if we're going to avoid using FAS plus F in any of our training plans, it just doesn't become a part of any of our training plans at all. So we can use antecedent arrangement, we can use differential, different types of reinforcement, we can use reinforcement placement, we can use all sorts of other things to avoid using extinction as a technique for training behavior or for behavior modification. Next, timeouts. So there are two forms of timeouts. One that probably does not cause frustration or anxiety. The other definitely does. So there are the two types of timeouts are exclusionary timeouts and non-exclusionary timeouts. So an exclusionary timeout is generally what we would think about as a timeout. I'm going to remove myself contingent on behavior. So for example, dog jumps on you and then you exit the room. Well, our timing for timeouts is absolutely terrible. There's too long of a period of time between the time that the animal does the behavior to the time that they're experiencing the removal of that reinforcer or potential reinforcement, because we're trying to use negative reinforcement. And this is a negative reinforcement or attempted a negative reinforcement contingency, right? So that is an exclusionary timeout. Hard to do. It's hard for the animal to make the connection between your behavior and its behavior, so that they're being left alone contingent on whatever that thing is. Non-exclusionary timeouts, however, and this is what Ken Ramirez and Susan Friedman call an LRS, or what started at SeaWorld as the least reinforcing scenario or least reinforcing stimulus. So an LRS really is a non-exclusionary timeout. And you can find that they cause less frustration or anxiety. And that is just a pause in training. You didn't get the right answer. We'll just wait for a second and then see if you do it or cue a new behavior. So here's an example of a non-exclusionary timeout. This is me, clearly, my backyard in the San Francisco Bay Area in Oakland, and my dog, Bruce Lee. And you'll see that his behavior, and I'll call out where I'm using the non-exclusionary timeout. So there's no audio, just in case you're trying to adjust your speakers. So you can't hear my click. Here's where he makes the mistake. Does the behavior, gets reinforced. So that was the non-exclusionary timeout. Any questions on that? I just covered a bunch of stuff and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I want to give you an opportunity because exclusionary, non-exclusionary timeouts may be new for you. Nope. Okay, cool. So next thing that we're not going to include in our behavior in training plans, if we're taking the least intrusive, minimally aversive, ethical standard, and really least restrictive and minimally aversive, is avoiding the use of no reward markers or NRMs. It's a condition punisher, which is intended to be applied when the learner makes a mistake. So you just saw what to do instead, which is a non-exclusionary timeout. No, the animal doesn't need to have any information about what they did wrong. If you're in the acquisition phase, it can disrupt the learner. And there's some research that was done at the University of North Texas and Jesus Rosales Ruiz's behavior lab that NRMs cause quite a bit of anxiety. And they definitely can cause frustration. I've certainly seen it. I've seen it causing fear quite a bit. And it's just really hard to do from a trainer perspective to be super fluent, have a high rate of reinforcement, and then also focus on the things that you don't want the animal to do, as opposed to just having a very clean, clear picture of what you want, setting the framework for the animal to do the thing through the careful use of antecedent arrangement. So next is low rate of reinforcement. So we want to deliver a really high rate of reinforcement. Well, what does that look like? So could I share the research done at University of North Texas? Yeah, I can look that up. I don't remember but actually if you look for, if you go to scholar.google.com, and if you look up Jesus Rosales Ruiz, it was co-published with one of his graduate students. And if you just look up NRMs, then you can find the research there. So I think Sheila, you may be looking to see if you can find that and put that in there. But or the UNT website, I'm pretty sure that is published on their website as well. I think that's where I found it in the past. Okay, so low rate of reinforcement, for example, like asking for multiple behaviors for each, especially in an acquisition phase, is just really tough for an animal. So I really avoid, unless I absolutely have to ask for multiple behaviors, like the times that you may need to do that if you're doing like competition. So if you're like doing competitive obedience or you're running agility, and you often are actually building in secondary reinforcers as opposed to giving primary reinforcers. So you can build and maintain secondary reinforcers. If you want to know more about building and maintaining secondary reinforcers, Ken has a really nice workshop on that at Clicker Expo. I think he does it almost every year. And then he also has a really good one on the KPA website on building secondaries. So what does high rate of reinforcement look like? So not dogs, clearly, but goats. So you can see myself and Terry Hayward training a couple of baby goats, and you'll see what a high rate of reinforcement looks like. Good. 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 Right, so our high rate of reinforcement, we're just getting that behavior, turning it into a fluent behavior over time. So want to take a little bit of a motivating operations commercial break to talk about one of the things that I often hear when I talk about high rate of reinforcement, which is that my dog is not food motivated. If your dog is still alive, they're food motivated. They have to be. They're a living being. They have to eat in order to stay alive. But what we're often actually observing without maybe knowing it is the effect of an abolishing operation on an eating behavior. So motivating operations come in two flavors. So establishing operations and abolishing operations. So focus on these two definitions first, and then I'll break down what that formula actually means. So establishing operations are things that increase the effectiveness of a reinforcer or establish something as a reinforcer. So I'll give you an example. I'm nearing 50. It's almost time for a colonoscopy. I know this is sort of gross, but sorry. But one of the things that you have to do is drink like just a heck of a lot of water. So on a normal day, if I, go for a nice walk, that is an establishing operation for water drinking behavior. I'm thirsty, want water, right? But if I have to drink just gallons and gallons of water, that becomes an abolishing operation. I am satiated. I do not want those last few drops, right? Or that last, 16 ounces or 8 ounces of water. That actually becomes a punisher. So that becomes an abolishing operation to water drinking behavior. So you're going to see me struggle of like, oh, I just can't even with that last bit. Okay. So same stimulus or same reinforcer, or same thing that is a reinforcer in some scenarios and a punisher in others. So satiation can become an abolishing operation for like eating behavior or water drinking behavior. We don't often find it as a abolishing operation for most dogs for eating behavior. And there are ethological reasons for that. But we do see fear and anxiety as abolishing operations for eating behaviors. So in the environment, if a dog is not eating food, then the most likely culprit for that is anxiety and stress, where you have some amount of a stress-induced anorexia for that moment. So whenever I hear a dog is not taking food, I'm looking to fear, anxiety, and stress as the culprits, as abolishing operations for food eating behavior. Other things that can become abolishing operations for food eating behavior, or the value of the reinforcer. So here's where we get to that, the formula. So motivating operations affect our SD, so the cue for a particular behavior, and the reinforcer. So if something is a reinforcer, then and the animal knows that they're going to get that reinforcer if they do that particular behavior. So an SD may be a cue for a sit. They know that they're going to get a Charlie bear. Well, in stressful situations, or if I just ate a steak, Charlie bear is going to be kind of gross. So they're like, yeah, no thanks. Not going to do. That's not enough for me to do that particular behavior. So then they don't respond to the SD. They don't respond to the cue to sit. But if you have like a big old piece of chicken, then that actually may be a reinforcer that is good enough to respond to that cue. So we have to look at the reinforcer strength, and that's SR. So There can be establishing operations and abolishing operations that affect reinforcement strength and then affect the response to a discriminative stimulus. I know we just went through it's a little bit more maybe unfamiliar concepts. So I'm looking to see if there are any questions on that. All right. Okay, so just wanted to put that in the context of the high rate of reinforcement that we can often, in order to change a potential abolishing operation for food aiding behavior, then we can move things, we can change our reinforcers, test out reinforcers, see what the animal actually prefers. So another piece that we're going to avoid is pushing criteria too fast or chunking steps. So pushing criteria too fast is just asking for behavior that the animal just isn't the previous step that we were at, if we're working through a shaping plan, is not fluent enough. So they're not ready for the next step. Putting the animal in a position where they can't. It's like taking a kid who's just learned their multiplication tables and then asking them to do some algebra. They're like, I don't even know what those X's and Y's are yet. So that's sort of an analogy to setting the dog up to fail. We need to be able to proof behaviors and get them really solid. And by proofing, I just mean taking it on the road. So it doesn't mean. So it just means that we're expanding the dog's repertoire where they actually can perform that behavior. Also thinking about motivating operations at every step of the way. All right. And then flooding. So what is flooding? You guys probably already know this already, but it is the exposure to a fear eliciting stimulus at full strength without escape. So if we're putting a fearful dog, let's say in a yard with a bunch of people and they're super fearful of people, then that would be, and they can't escape from it, that's flooding. So whenever we're working with fearful animals, that we're working with them at a pace that they can tolerate each step of the way, right? So we're not that's also related to pushing criteria. Sometimes if we're pushing criteria for a fearful animal, that actually constitutes flooding. So we want to not flood as much as we can. Is there some amount of, oh, thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Sheila. So there is some amount of flooding that is inherent in the shelter environment. We can try to reduce it as much as possible by using curtains, by having the animals be able to escape. We see this with cats, right? So if we put like a box and some places for the animal to hide, then we're reducing the amount of flooding that animal is exposed to. So there's quite a bit of research on flooding. This is almost 100 years old now, 90 years of research on flooding and why it's not a good idea. But even the earlier research and even more recent research is that if you use flooding as a behavior technique or as a behavior modification technique, that you actually see a rebound in the fear and that it goes beyond the previous levels. So while you may see that the animals like tolerates whatever that thing is, so for example, like kittens, if you use flooding as a procedure for socializing them, we actually see hyperattachment to one particular figure quite often, but then a return of the fear to either the baseline or close to baseline behavior or worse than baseline. And that's borne out in the research over time as well. And then any application of aversive stimuli. So using loud noises, shock collars, bone collars, spray bottles, shake hands, anything like that. Those are definitely not LIMA, and they can cause fear and anxiety for sure. So we seek to avoid those as much as we possibly can, given the environment. All right. So what is threshold? I promised that I would talk about threshold. So threshold, the best definition, and there's not actually a behavior analytic definition of threshold. It's something that we use quite often when we're talking about behavior modification, we're talking about training, is keeping an animal under threshold. But there's not just one threshold. We talk about it almost as if there is just one threshold that but there are thresholds for anxiety, fear, frustration, arousal, aggression. Those are the bad thresholds that we're usually working under. But it's the threshold is the point at which behavior changes. So you can have a happiness threshold as well. We go from fine to like, oh my gosh, I won the lottery, pushed over the happiness threshold, right? So we're just really talking about behavior change. But the ones where what we're usually interested in are fear thresholds, aggression thresholds, frustration thresholds. And what I'm really interested in playgroup is arousal thresholds, keeping dogs under a certain level of arousal, because then we often see that tip over to aggression. So this is me with one of my fearful dogs. I'm working him just under, again, not a behavior analytic term, but just under threshold. So you notice that I'm trying to set up this scenario where he has a number of choices. So I'm between degrees of freedom of 2 and 3. So he has, and 4 in some cases. So the setup is that he's on this little platform thing. He can do lots of things on the platform. He has learned lots of behaviors. And so that is a place where he offers. So that's part of antecedent arrangement you can get lots of ways of getting reinforcement. What I really am trying to do, there's a person that is about 20 feet away from him and that he's afraid of. So working distance here, and that person is behaving like a statue. They're sort of standing there. You'll see a point in time when I ask them to shuffle their feet. There's also a curtain that's in the middle of my yard, and he can go behind the curtain. There is a bunch of food that is scattered over there, and my office door where he can go and completely escape. So he can gain reinforcement by working with me, or he can gain reinforcement by going away and getting away from that fear eliciting stimulus. So, and then there's a point in time when he goes over threshold and then recovers. But this is an example of working under threshold. We just went over a fear threshold. That's where I just asked the person to shuffle their feet. So you can see that kind of just under threshold, he's actually pretty tense, right? So he's doing lots of the things. He's just under, and he's performing lots of different different cued behaviors and non-cued behaviors. So I'm reinforcing him whether that is cued or not. And then I also wanted to remind him that he can completely escape this scenario by going behind the curtain, not getting any visual exposure to the person, and going into the office into his crate where there's also a bunch of food. So that's an example of kind of working at a threshold. He went over threshold. That's not desired, but it happens. And he recovered pretty quickly, which is what I want to see. Any questions on that? Squatting near him, I'm not sure if it helped or not. It often does with a fearful animal. If I didn't know him well, he is one of my dogs, so he's pretty fine. He's used to me standing up, squatting down, all of that. So it may have helped him a little bit. It was more for my comfort and so that I could deliver reinforcer faster.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering whether that might have been something that increased safety and helped him to feel safe.
Maybe it may have. I didn't see a significant change in his behavior when he did that, but I'll actually review the video again and see if I saw him relax a little bit. Argo says, yes, please review the video again. You missed something, Mom. All right, so what does LIMA-based training look like? So I gave you some examples of the principles leading up to that, but when you put it into practice, putting all of those things into practice, what do you do? What do you do? So first is teach behaviors using positive reinforcement. I'll show you some examples of using positive reinforcement for behavioral acquisitions. With those baby goats, they had been at the ranch for 2 days. They were learning how to target. That is one of the base behaviors that certainly used, but we're exclusively using positive reinforcement to install behaviors. And then making it easy. This is part of so there's a difference between the least intrusive, minimally aversive LIMA ethical standard and the hierarchy of behavior change procedures. And when we look at the hierarchy of behavior change procedures, which I threw a version into this at the very end, if you want me to review it real quick. But you're probably thinking of that roadmap that Susan Friedman has popularized. And this is part of antecedent arrangement. So when we are making it easy for the animal to do the behavior, we are doing it in a place where they're familiar, that you're not adding a bunch of other distractions, and that you're doing everything you can in the environment to support that animal doing pretty much only the right thing. And that's what antecedent arrangement means. Providing options. You just saw an example of how I provided options to Pluto. This is actually an area of growth for me as well, is really kind of very thoughtfully thinking about all of the different ways that I can increase the degrees of freedom that my animals have when they're in a training scenario or in a behavior modification scenario. So I definitely need to get better at that. I'd love to have degrees of freedom of 5. Lots of different ways for my animals to contact reinforcement that don't necessarily include coming to me. So remote feeders can be some of them. And that's where when I was, providing piles of food for Pluto, saying you don't have to be here. You don't have to be exposed to the scary stimulus. If you do, I will make it worth your while. But you're going to get the same food over there as you are over here. So that concept of working for food is called contra freeloading, if you want to take a look at that concept. So say that at least in that instance, he's a contra freeloader. All right. And then changing behavior, observing the function. So this is a really important piece of ABA. So if we're employing some of the methods of applied behavior analysis and a behavior analytic approach, we're definitely observing the function of the behavior. Is the behavior distance increasing, distance decreasing? What are the reinforcers that are maintaining or strengthening the behavior? Are we doing a preference test for the animal that we're not giving them Charlie bears when they really want steak? So we're thinking about that preference as part of the motivating operations, as part of the MOs. Is this a species typical behavior? Do we expect them to do that? Is there another way that we can provide an outlet for that particular species typical behavior? Let's say digging. For example, dogs, I have a Chihuahua. She loves to dig. I have a digging pit for her. I just didn't pave over a piece of dirt and then I just, encourage her to dig in that spot. So it's essentially DRO, right? So is that something that we wouldn't necessarily, well, I'm certainly not going to use punishment, but we definitely don't want to take out of their repertoire because it's biologically driven. But we don't necessarily want it to be where we've planted our flowers. So any questions on any of those? Observing the function reinforcer. And also when we're thinking about from an ABA or behavior analytic approach, we're measuring change. So training an alternative behavior using positive reinforcement after we have observed what the function of that behavior is, and we've selected whether it's going to be a differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors, differential reinforcement of another behavior, lower intensity behavior, etc. And then when we're putting it in the behavior into the context in which the problem behavior occurred, we're doing that slowly and carefully and methodically so that we're not, because when we're using DROs, we're technically using extinction because we're no longer reinforcing a previously reinforced behavior. So, but if we do it well, the animal doesn't experience the same level of frustration, anxiety if we were to use pure extinction. And this is a really important component of LIMA. We are phoning a friend. I always talk to friends, colleagues about, making sure that I have the concept right, that I'm on the right track for behavior plan, just reviewing a behavior plan. Do you have any other ideas, even if I'm not even before I run into any roadblocks? In fact, I run a monthly for some of our local trainers, have a monthly behavior roundtable where we discuss our cases. Because more eyes and more brains on behavior problems is always beneficial for everybody. So that's a key component, is the phone a friend, and also not taking any cases that you don't have the knowledge and skill for. And then I'd refer you back to that section on, well, what is the knowledge and skill of behavior trainers and behavior consultants? That's all the things that I noted previously. All right. So I reached back into, I haven't taken cases in a couple of years, but I reached back into my decade or so of behavior cases and pulled out a couple of that might be interesting to explore. So the first is Jax. So he was a little scruffy, cute little guy. And he was really anxious about getting in the car and riding in the car. So what did we do? So that was the presenting problem. So our training plan was counter condition the car. So that's a whole lot of stuff. So seeing the car move when he's not in it, going in the car, going out of the car, but always giving him a ton of choice. And watching his body language, making sure that his body was completely relaxed, that he was excited about it, One of the nice things about this particular case is that the person lived in Berkeley, across the street from a bank that was only open Monday through Friday. So the bank parking lot, I think it was like a business bank. The bank parking lot was completely empty on the weekends. So she could just drive her car across the street and we could walk Jack's across the street. And we could do all the things. So we gradually shaped the duration of the time in the car, added a little bit of movement. She was able to, she'd go in the car, she could drive a foot, stop, make sure that he was totally fine. So we're constantly looking for him as calm and relaxed. Calm and relaxed also means that he's not barking in the car. Why did she even care? Well, she was going on a multi-state road trip and she wanted to be able to take him with her. So he was super responsive to the counter conditioning procedures. They were able to do the road trip, no problem. But how does that fit into LIMA? So we didn't use any sort of flooding. So we very, very carefully did not expose him. It did not put him in the car. And then, because that would be a place where we'd be at high risk of flooding because he'd go in the car and then not be able to escape. So wanted to make sure that there was like lots of choice, that he was going in by himself, he was coming out, he definitely got reinforced for going in and going out and just doing any sort of thing. So we gradually increased the time that he was in the car. It only took like 6 weeks for us to get to that place. And we were working like just once a week, really. She wasn't doing a ton of stuff in between. So we're not talking about a ton of sessions in order to get him from being like super stressed out, being in the car and barking his little head off, to him just being like, oh, okay, I chill. This is what we do in the vehicle. So any questions on that or any of the training procedures on that? It's relatively simple counter conditioning. It's just that we had to think of all the permutations of entering from this side or that side. Okay, awesome. Great. So Emmy was a female pit bull type dog. They never did a DNA, but she's a, blocky headed cutie girl. She was actually in my neighborhood. So over by Highland Hospital, if you're familiar with Oakland at all, she was found running at large by the husband. So this is actually interesting because she became super fearful of the husband. This is not actually her. I just found a stock photo, but it's close, kind of close enough to what she looks like. She was a brown and white kind of pity mix. So she ended up getting taken to the East Bay SPCA and got spayed and held for a stray period. And then they decided to adopt her since nobody came forward. They brought her home, and then all of a sudden she was like, hey, Andy, you're really scaring me. So Andy's the husband. And so what our training plan was they lived in a relatively small apartment in an old Victorian. So kind of the railway type of apartment that had a couple of bedrooms and then opened up to what was technically a living room, but they turned it into a bedroom. So it was really hard for Emmy to escape from Andy, which is the fear eliciting stimulus, right? So it's really hard not to flutter. But what they did have was a nice little office space. So we established that safe place for Emmy. Andy didn't go in there. And we had baby gates, coverings, all of that. And that we established that as just a place where reinforcement happens, that all the good things happen in that. Thankfully, Lori, who was the mom, that Emmy was totally fine with her. They had a cat. Cat was great with her and Emmy, so she would do training sessions in there with Emmy. We established a daily routine where Emmy could remain under threshold as much as possible while we're desensitizing her and counter conditioning her to Andy's presence. We did muzzle training for the eventuality of her, re-engaging with Andy. And it was really important when we're talking about any form of aggression, potential aggression, that we're tracking daily behavior. Because from the very beginning, I was like, I think we're probably going to need to work with a VB. And sure enough, she was moderately responsive to counter conditioning procedures, but not enough for me to feel really comfortable. So we ended up working with the Martins in Texas. So they had a vet-to-vet with their veterinarian, and they started Emmy on meds. And that's where documentation is super important, to share that with the veterinary behaviorist, and also just track progress. Data is a really important piece of doing behavior modification work when we're talking about major fear. So she actually did a really nice narrative. She journaled like everything, which was really cool. So she was the client was super compliant with journaling. So with psychopharmaceuticals, her behavior improved significantly. So she was very responsive. And then over time, so that just helped our counter conditioning procedures. And she's now comfortable with the husband. They've now moved to Berkeley, into a bigger home. It's great. But, after we did the process of, very systematic desensitization and counter conditioning, she was then super comfortable with Andy. I still get photos of them snuggling and such. But that was essentially what it was just being really, really careful about everybody's safety, and making sure that she was very, very comfortable, that we're avoiding flooding as much as we possibly could. So any questions on any of that? All right. Either I'm being really clear, you guys are really bored. It's hard to tell in a distance environment. All right, so again, these are photos that are close enough to the dogs, but Ebony and Ivory were both actually adopted from my previous shelter, Contra Costa Animal Services. One of them, Ivory, was the first to be adopted by the couple, and then they took in Ebony a couple years after. So both spayed female pit bull type dogs. They're probably pretty mixy, I'd say. So maybe 3 or 4 breeds that are in there. So the problem behavior was interdog aggression, resulting in significant injury to Ivory. Hold on just a moment. Hey.
Just a reminder, as we're waiting for Mara to come back, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chats.
So that whining was my dog needing access to water. So she's good now. So problem behavior was interdog aggression, resulting in significant injury to Ivory. Based on what I was able to gather from the event, it was pretty severe resource guarding over an Isle of Bone. So interdog resource guarding, we sort of expect to be that dramatic, not so much. So we did some pretty intense crate and rotate, especially while Ivory was healing. So I didn't want to do any sort of introduction or reintroduction of the 2 girls. until both of the dogs were feeling really good, as I didn't want any sort of pain to come up when we were doing any sort of introductions, because that can, responding conditioning is a very important piece of all of this, right? So we want just good feelings after a really bad feeling between the two. So fortunately, they had a 2-bedroom home. They were able to do crate and rotate, and it's not actually not with crates, but with rooms. Each girl had their room. The husband and wife had very good communication with each other, so they were able to do crate and rotate very well. And then when we started with it, before we started with integration, muzzle training, again, super important. I want to have at least 2 levels of safety. So, or 3 if we can. So I want to have a muzzle, a gate, and a leash on, so that the dogs can't get to each other and injure each other, especially when we're doing some sort of reintroduction. So we wanted to make sure that their spaces were like super awesome, that they loved them. They would get, that was their safe and fun place, because they would hear each other and like whine. They seemed to want to get reintroduced. And I was like, not until we're totally healed. So we did muzzle training, and then protected contact training with the girls between a barrier. So started with just, they built a repertoire while they were in crate and rotate, so that they had a bunch of different behaviors that they were doing. So they would just be right next to each other and doing training sessions just to build that respondent, a positive CER in the presence of that other dog, but with their muzzles on, with a gate between them, and with leashes on. So we did that for a little bit, and then slowly started to take the gate away, slowly started to take the leashes away, with a lot of tracking of their progress. And they did great. It was a one-time incident, but with any interdog aggression, I mean, you may be thinking like, gosh, Mari kind of took it too far on the safety piece. But if you've ever seen a dog fight, kind of want to take it a little super safe. And these were not, they're not trainers. They're not going to read the body language very well. So they're not going to see a lot of the precursor behaviors. So just wanted to take a really, really careful approach. And so now the girls live together. They're totally fine. And the really strict management thing is you don't have any toys or anything on the ground. And they were able to do that simple thing, and they're great. And it's been now 3 years, and they're still, the mom is actually just finishing up her training as a medical doctor, as an orthopedic surgeon. So super successful, and very, just using positive reinforcement and management. Wasn't that, I mean, it was, a little bit to, explain and get them on board. But in terms of like training techniques, we're not talking about anything that's like, super complicated. So if you want to learn more, here's a couple of resources: Behavior Analysis and Learning by Pearson Cheney, ABA by Cooper Hewan and Heward, Heron and Heward. That is actually a really awesome go-to book. It has like everything you might want. It's also like that thick. But if you want like a single source for ABA and all of the concepts on MOs and non-exclusionary and exclusionary timeouts and all that stuff, that is the resource. And then, because I try to live what I speak, Dr. Eduardo Fernandez, if you haven't seen his talks, he's amazing. He checked all of my content, make sure that I wasn't explaining anything incorrectly. And then also Keem C, who is my ops person, for any of the concepts that we wanted to have presented, and just double checking all of that. So if you want to reach out to me for any questions or anything, or learn about more what we do at Shelter Playgroup Alliance, Shelter Dog Play is the website. You can always shoot me an email. And then here's sorry, I was just the one that I had at the ready this morning, as I was like, oh, hierarchy of behavior change procedures I was translating one of my presentations into Spanish. So this is the one that pulled out. So I'm happy to translate that on the fly, but I think you guys probably know it anyway. So any questions? What did you use for reinforcement for reintroducing ebony and ivory? Since reinforcement includes a high value resource. Yeah, so actually if they were training and food was controlled, they were totally fine. It was something on the ground that they were both going for at the same time. But if they were just they could train side by side with no problem. So they wouldn't try to like get in each other's space. So they used, I do have all of my clients, or did have all of my clients, and still ask people to do a preference test. So we would give the higher preference food. That's actually a really key principle in doing any counter conditioning work, is that you see what the animal likes. And then when you're trying to establish a positive condition emotional response, that you're using the highest value, that the animal has told you that it's high value, that you're not making an assumption that hot dogs are the thing, but that you're saying, would you like hot dogs? Would you like this? Would you like that? And I'm always surprised. I had one dog who, one of his highest preferred things were corn chips. I was like, I don't know if that's healthy for you, but I get that you like it. I mean, I like them too. So we used them, parsimoniously in the training. So I was like, I don't know. But so give an example of aversive stimuli, but not a punisher. Yeah. So anything that, so like a loud noise often is an aversive stimuli, but not a punisher. So the definition of a punisher is something that will decrease the probability of that behavior happening in the future. I often see like people's attempt at using a squirt bottle as just an aversive stimuli, but it's not actually punishing, that the dog continues to go back and do that thing over and over again. I saw somebody using compressed air on a dog. And the dog continued to do that thing. I mean, it would temporarily, they'd be like, I don't like it, but more motivated to do that thing over there. So MOs come into play in lots of things, right? But yeah, so there's lots of examples of aversive stimuli. Yeah, or if we think about our own like alcohol consumption across the pandemic, right? If we've increased our alcohol consumption, maybe we have a little bit of a headache. Not enough to punish, but it sure is aversive.
Mara, this is amazing. Thank you so much. I have a couple questions, and if anyone else has questions, please type them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. I'd love if you can talk in a little more detail about the my dog isn't food motivated piece, and when you have people say that, things you do to manipulate the situation to help the dog.
Yeah. So most often when I see that, when I hear people say my dog isn't food motivated, for private clients, it's quite often that whatever they're giving the animal, that the animal just doesn't like. One of my dogs, the one that you heard who said, I'm really thirsty, I need to go outside. She will take whatever if I give her something that she doesn't like, she'll take it and then push it back into my hand. It's very clear communication of like, that's disgusting. Not all dogs will do that. But sometimes that the reinforcer itself is just not of a value. But it's not that she's not hungry or that she's too stressed to eat. It's just that the thing that I'm handing her is not interesting to her at all. So that's where preference tests come into play. But most often when I see it is when an animal is too stressed to eat. So, when we are super stressed, there is a suppression of appetite. So that's what I mean by stress-induced anorexia. Or temporary suppression of appetite. In the shelter setting, we often see stress-induced anorexia, that the dog just isn't eating that food. So then you can change the environment. So quite often I'm seeing that because there's flooding, but the person doesn't realize that they're actually flooding the animal. So they're not recognizing that they're being exposed to a fear eliciting stimulus at full strength without escape. So for example, like a walk, that the dog is super hypervigilant, they're scanning the environment, their body is really tense, and they're not taking treats. And that goes back to also this need for real fluent reading of body language, understanding stress signals, looking at the pupil dilation, looking at respiration rate. If you can, with little Pluto, I often feel his chest to see, especially when I have a vet come over and we're doing anything on him, because that can be a little bit scary, because there's that's sort of out of necessity. We need to do that, but I feel his heart rate to see if there's anything that increases. And if it does, we take a break. So that's a really important piece of reading. So I don't wait till he stops eating. I look at his heart rate as an indication, because all of that is our nervous system saying, I'm scared. All right. Any other questions? Did that answer that, Sheila? Do you think there's anything else that you wanted me to cover?
I have one other question, if no one else has other questions. And my other question is about non-exclusionary timeouts. Mm-hmm. I noticed that you maintained eye contact during that non-exclusionary timeout, the video you showed. And can you talk about maintaining eye contact versus not maintaining eye contact? If you were to remove eye contact, would that then be an exclusionary timeout? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. I didn't. So the exclusionary versus non-exclusionary timeout is with the contact of reinforcement. So Bruce Lee in that moment was not getting contact with reinforcement. For him, eye contact doesn't make a difference in his behavior or not. With other dogs, Argos, who you heard barking, eye contact is very much a reinforcer. So he looks for that as part of the training package. In addition, he's also one of the few dogs that I can actually give him pets, and that will actually reinforce behavior. Bruce Lee is not that. So for him, eye contact didn't really matter.
Okay,
but it can for sure.
Okay, and so for a dog where it does matter, if you're doing non-exclusionary timeout, even if it does matter, you maintain that eye contact, or you would look away for.
I'd look away if that's a reinforcer. I'm trying to take out, like, you're not doing the thing, so no reinforcer here. Try again is essentially the communication, and then that's usually enough for them to go, oh, you wanted this instead? Yeah, actually I do. Or if they don't do this instead, then you cue high probability behavior. So high probability behaviors are the ones that, at least for me, and for a lot of trainers, that they'll use, because it's one of the easiest behavior to train, like a hand target or a target to an object. There are many species that you don't want to hand target. I'm not hand targeting a lion, for example.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mara. I don't see any other questions. Mara, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Several people have asked about a recording. Yes, we will be sharing a recording for people who are not able to attend. Next month, we will be talking about resource guarding. Thank you, everybody, for joining. There's Mara's contact information, and let's all give Mara a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all next month.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invite. Bye, Sheila.
Bye.